coming to our Monday night meeting. I'm Jeannie, and my husband Alex is manning the camera. We're the Good Life Stewards this summer, and we're really happy to have you with us. Tonight we're super excited about having Dr. Alison Dibble here to talk to us all about bees. Alison shared with me earlier that she got really interested in this after an encounter with a bear and her bees, her honeybees. And so she became more interested in the native bee population because she wasn't in a position to replace her honeybees. And so she said, I'm going to dig into the native honeybees. And so tonight she's going to tell us her story and about how to fortify your yard for Maine native honeybees. Next Monday night we have Caitlin Shetterly, who grew up in Surrey, daughter of Robert Shetterly, and she's going to talk to us about her research on GMOs. She wrote a book. I'm really looking forward to that one. And then the following Monday, and Caitlin's presentation is in partnership with the Brooksville Library. Wonderful. And then Monday the 21st, the Mercer family will be here, and they're going to tell us some about their experience at Standing Rock. It's going to be multimedia. It's going to be a heartfelt experience. They're going to bring music. Should be a wonderful time. And then our final meeting is on the 28th, and it will be at the Brooksville Library, and it will be a panel discussion about the nearing legacy and its impact on Brooksville.
So Caitlin will be here.
Caitlin will be here. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Thank you all for coming again, and hope to see you again. And go out.
Thank you, Jeannie. Well, it's wonderful to see friends and to see new friends and just welcome everybody. It's a great privilege to be standing here in the Nearing's wonderful home. And remember, well, I'll share with you, I got to have lunch with Helen and Scott many years ago, and it was a very special event for me. And I recall that partway through the lunch, Scott went back to digging in the garden, and I hope I can do that when I'm 100. So tonight, I just want to share with you some of my enthusiasm for little animals that we might take for granted. And this is a talk that includes honeybees, but the emphasis is especially on the native bees, and I hope to be able to convince you that all of them are important and that you might be able to make more of a contribution than you realize in improving their habitats. Now, since I started talking about bees, actually quite some time ago, there have been some important developments. You probably are aware that now there's a federally endangered bee called the rusty patch. And I'm going to use what I'm going to interpret as Scott's walking stick to point out the orange on the back of the rusty patch. And people get all excited because they think they're seeing the rusty patch bumblebee when they encounter a very common bee that we have in abundance here in Maine, the tricolored or orange-banded bumblebee. But this is in fact a different species. And this is just indicative of the kind of challenge in identifying native bees that anyone who gets interested in this would soon come up against. But there's an amazing tool called Discover Life that is housed in part through the American Museum of Natural History. It's available to anyone free on the internet. And if you get interested in native bees, you might wish to take a look at Discover Life and learn how to identify them. And you'll probably want them dead for that exercise. And we won't go into that right now. We're going to talk about their lives and their ecology and what they need for their habitat. But just so that you know, soon you might have boxes and boxes of dead bees on pins with little labels, and it can turn into that. Now, this talk is going to be not just a general talk about bees in Maine, but we'll get into the issues of honeybee decline very briefly. That involves some discussion of pesticides, and we'll talk about the relevance of the native bees and honeybees to a really important crop in this part of Maine, and that's the wild blueberry or lowbush blueberry, Vaccinium angustifolium. But all of that leads up to a 4-year project that I was involved with. In fact, I led this part of a much larger project of more than $3 million grant to the University of Maine and 4 other institutions to study pollinator security. And that all has to do with our food supply. If we aren't getting certain crops pollinated because there are no bees, then we're lacking in some very important foods that most of us really like to eat. So I'll tell you about the bee module experiment and give you some results from that that may or may not be useful in your own garden. And then we'll talk briefly about how you can improve habitats for bees at your house. Now, I promised some folks who are here from another part of the world that I would present a few things up front so that if they can't stay to the very end of tonight's talk, we regret that they have to leave, but they'll at least know that there are 270 species of native bees that have been documented in Maine. We're just about to release this paper. It's already been accepted. It'll be published in the Northeastern Naturalist with some color pictures. It won't be everything about bees that you ever would want to know, but it would get you started toward learning about them. The bees that we notice most often might be the queen bumblebees in spring. They're large, they're making a noise. They might be going along at the lawn or at the edge of the woods, and they're looking for a place to establish their colony for the season. So we notice those, but there are many, many more bees that may be small and dark and fairly nondescript. They might look like a tiny wasp, and most of us wouldn't perhaps think, oh, that's a bee. But they are very important either to each other or to certain plants, and they're part of the ecosystem. We don't know very much about most bee species that are in Maine. Only a few have been relatively well studied. So I hope you'd keep that in mind as we're talking about some of the other aspects from tonight's presentation. And then when it comes to enhancing, they call it enhancing, improving bee habitat at your house, you might save some money and perhaps reduce the possibility that you're going to ruin something that's already functioning pretty well by first seeing what you already have. And it could be that you've already got ground nesting bee habitat in a bare patch in the lawn, or maybe along a road embankment. You might already have a lot of wildflowers around the edges and the bees are on those. And so there could be any number of things. But we'll also talk about what it would be like if you decided to add floral resources. What are some plants you might choose? And that's where the bee module experiment comes in. That was a test of what do the bees like and how do we have them attracted to the garden. Turns out that the bees don't like just any plant. Some they like much better than others. So just to help you get started in this, I'd like to remind you, and these are some things that you probably already know, that bees are wildlife and they are part of the biodiversity of the native natural ecosystems. They are our most effective pollinators, and we wouldn't want to take anything away from the butterflies, moths, hummingbirds, wasps, flies. In fact, in higher elevations and colder climates, flies really are the key pollinators. But in our climate and our North Temperate Zone, bees are our most effective pollinators for our flora. Their food is pollen and nectar, and the bees, are crucial to our food security, as I mentioned. They also pollinate the native plants, and they are necessary for production of wildflower mixes. So if you decide you want to plant a wildflower mix, you would want to know that it's because of bees that you're able to buy the mix and then plant it in your yard. Now, they do have pressures from predators, and some of these are the native predators with which they evolved, and others have recently arrived into North America, and they aren't as perhaps well set up to withstand those particular pressures. I personally think they're really fun to study. And this is not a promise, but I don't think you're going to get stung. It's going to be yellow jackets that you stepped in their nest. Those are what the foresters call bees. Those really will hurt when they sting. And I've read that they can sting repeatedly without dying and chase you. I mean, I've experienced them chasing me. But bees tend, when they sting, to lose their stinger. And that, at least honeybees, that would be something that you'd want to just know about. And then honeybees, many people aren't completely aware of this. Honeybees are not native to North America. However, if you want honey and wax, honeybees is where you're going to need to go. Now, let's look at the question of why we see bees on flowers. It's a mating site, and the bees that we tend to see on flowers most often are the females. The males are flying in a zigzag fashion near the flowers, but they're scouting for females. So they're kind of doing this. They may land and rest briefly. They might drink a little bit of nectar, but mostly it's about getting their genes into the next generation. But the females have a very dedicated work ethic. And they are gathering pollen and nectar, and with their saliva, they're forming a little loaf. I didn't make this up. And that will go in the nest, and she keeps bringing more and more pollen and nectar and saliva and making the loaf large enough that when she lays her egg on top of it, it then is the food source that will allow the larva to develop into the next phase of being the emerging bee. And in order to reinforce something I'll say at least several times, when it comes to putting plants in the garden or assessing what you already have, you do want to have plants that flower early, some that are in the middle of the summer, and some that are late. Now we can look out the window and see Queen of the Meadow, which is a beautiful plant, and there's a nice big patch of it. And I can see meadowsweet, and I think there's some marigolds in the wheelbarrow, and there's actually quite a bit in flower right now, so that's great for the bees. And then late is really important, and the people who keep honeybees care a lot about late, because this is going to be the honey that will help the bees to get through the winters, those fall stores. And so the fall nectar flow is very important for honeybees. This bee that you see in this picture is a very interesting one. This has the hairs on which it can collect the pollen on the bottom of the abdomen. And this is a megachilid, I'm going to say, and it's on a plant that I like very much called bird's foot trefoil, which tends to attract the leafcutter and mason bees. Now, here you get to see the egg on the loaf. This is a loaf just being started, and here is the egg on top of the loaf. And here the larva has developed and is starting to feed on the loaf. And here's the pupa, and that eventually will emerge and be ready to mate and fly as the adult. Now this is the life cycle for a solitary ground nesting bee. This doesn't apply to honeybees or to bumblebees. But the solitary ground nesting bees are quite diverse in Maine, and you may see these. There are many kinds. And they're really very interesting, so I thought you'd like to see what their life cycle entails. Now, you probably already know how important bees are to the economics of agriculture. You may not have realized there are about 20,000 bee species in the world, with new ones being described on a fairly regular basis. And as we don't know very much about most of the bee species that are in Maine, we also know almost nothing about many, many of those 20,000 species. That also is an estimate. So there's a lot yet to be learned about bees. But these are wasps, essentially, that stopped going to get larvae and taking prey into their nest, and instead they have the adaptations for collecting nectar and pollen. But it's thought that bees evolved from wasps and then lost that, essentially that carnivorous habit. I've mentioned the females are the ones they're provisioning their brood. That's how we talk about the egg being laid on the loaf and so forth. That's what they're doing, is gathering the resources so that their next generation will have a good start. Now, honeybees, if you say bees, we're going to have a talk about bees, most people think honeybees. And they have actually been, shall we say, domesticated since, it's thought, about 900 BC. And that's when people started to harvest their pollen and their nectar and maybe some of the other products of the hive. They're thought to have been introduced in North America as of about 1622. Now, some crops don't need any bees at all, and you can certainly think of many of these. Wheat would be one, corn is another, carrots would be, unless you're going to get some carrot seed, you can eat a carrot without having any bee present. But there are some other crops that absolutely require bees, and then there's a whole gradient of crops that benefit if bees are present. The fruits will be larger, there'll be more seeds, they'll be juicier and plumper, and you'll have a better yield. Now, the ones that are listed here in bold, almonds, low bush or wild blueberry, such as what we grow here in Maine, cucumbers, melons, pumpkins, and squash, those are absolutely dependent on bees to move pollen, without which we're not going to have a blueberry or the squash or the pumpkin. But some of these others really benefit if the bees are present when the flowers are out, but it's not as much of an absolute for those. And you can see some of them in the list here. If anyone can't read this, just let me know. I'll tell you anything that's in the slide. This is the Falls Bridge over in Blue Hill. It's slated to be replaced or renovated. We have one objector in the crowd. Okay. And people feel very strongly about this bridge. But I wanted to note that this bee, which in this case is Bombus vagans, the half-black bumblebee, another native bee and very common in our area, is all over in our area and likely to be found on this rose. And this rose looks like pasture rose. Now, you don't have to read this slide. I'll tell you what the high points are here. We're about to release this paper, as I mentioned, with the checklist of the bees of Maine. And I thought you'd be interested in how many different bee families and bee genera and bee species. And the species, by the way, are these numbers that follow a genus. So there are 50 species of Andrena. This is a minor bee. And there are about 50 species likewise of Lasioglossum. Well, we have 32 in this slide, but we're above that now. The rest have many fewer. Bumblebees tend to get much more attention than these other groups. And I have my hypothesis about this. I think it's because they're larger and people notice them and recognize them. Oh yeah, there's a bumblebee. And I think also that because they're very important pollinators of blueberry and some other crops, they're strong flyers. They can fly at cooler temperatures than many other bees, including honeybees. And they have a colonial habit. They have their underground, or maybe it's in an old mattress nest, and they have multiple bees that are generated in that one colony, and they're workers that go out and tend to the colony. I think that's why they get so much attention. But each of these other genera are unique and special in their own ways too. So I just wanted to share with you how diverse the bees of Maine are. Here's a thing I'm not sure you're aware of, is that there are nest parasites in the bee world. These are bees that maybe look a little bit like their bee host. will go in the nest and lay their egg on the loaf or in the nest, and eventually can take over the nest and destroy the native bee host. Now, in this example, you can see what looks like a bumblebee, and it's bombus. It was in a genus formerly called Cytheris, but we don't use that so much anymore. But on its hind legs, it doesn't have the pollen baskets that you would see in a regular bumblebee. So this will go into the nest and subdue or kill the queen, that is the host species, and enslave her daughters. And then her daughters will feed her own brood, the parasites' brood. So, and this is part of evolution and leads to a diversity of species. It's a pressure that bees have on themselves. Not all bees are subject to this as much as others. Here's another one. This is Nomada, and it's a very pretty bee. Well, some people would say so. With brick red and sort of an ivory, and it has a slender body. It looks like a wasp, very narrow waist, but it isn't. It is a bee, and it will take over the nest of Andrena, the minor bee, of which Maine has 50 species. So, here's what this looks like underground. Here you're looking at a diagram by Eben Osgood, who was my teacher for entomology. I had him this very last semester before he retired, and I really enjoyed it. He thought of bees as like little machines. I often think about that. So anyway, this is the surface of the earth going along, and this might be a roadside bank, it could be a bare patch in the blueberry field or whatever, but it's probably a sunny, well-drained spot. And the bee nests can go down even up to about 3 feet, if you can picture it. And there are these little side chambers, and this is where the bee has come down and she's making her loaf. Don't you think that's incredible? Now, his particular angle on this paper that he wrote and for which he prepared this diagram is that sometimes in some of these areas, this is a solitary bee, mind you, but the tunnels connect. And it could be that the tunnels are very old and the whole nest may be many years old and gets reused over and over. So when the little bee is born, okay, the adult, the pupa, has developed into the adult, and she's going to emerge for the first time for the season. There'll be the males that come out first because they have to be ready to mate. But the males will come and they'll make their way up. How they find their way up, there may be chemical cues, maybe there's some gravity involved, and make their way to the top. They have to dig the last bit out. Amazing. Yes. So, but that's where the parasitic bee is going to go also and lay its egg on that of the host. And so the host comes along and she goes, wait a minute, I don't think I laid my egg there yet. And she goes on and starts another loaf because there's already an egg. It's a pretty finely tuned system. Now, my nephew asked me if I could please include a slide that tells more about the predators. So I thought of all the predators I could think of, and you can maybe think of even more, but these are bee eaters. I think this is in Hungary, the European bee eaters. And so they're eating bees. And we also have bears, spiders. Spiders, have you ever seen that? Like on a rose, there's this white or pinkish or yellowish spider. They're deadly to bees. They bite them right behind their head, and that's curtains for the bee. Fungi are a very serious problem for bees. There are also mites that might get in the trachea and elsewhere, and they suck bee blood and are very debilitating to the bees. And birds. Oh my goodness. I took this picture, Yellowrump Warbler, also known as a myrtle warbler, on a willow. In the spring, willow is a really important plant to the early bees. They go to both the male and the female plants. You remember that willow is dioecious, meaning that all the flowers on one plant are either male or female, and likewise on another plant, either male or female. But it doesn't matter, the bees are on both of them. And so this hungry little warbler is going to have a lunch of bees. Pardon me? No, that's the warbler. It's cool, isn't it? Now let's talk a little bit about honeybee decline. This is just a really sad thing to see. We're talking now about beekeepers in the U.S. and how the losses over the winter have been very high since about 2006 or so. It actually goes back earlier, but it was an outstanding phenomenon in 2006 and made the national news that beekeepers were losing their bees over the winter. Sometimes all their bees would be gone, or at least some pretty high percentage. The acceptable range here, this is, I know you can't read this, but this is 15%. That's considered acceptable to lose 15% of your hives in the winter. You might not like that, but that's considered acceptable. But here we've got about 32%, here 37%, and so forth. Now, these data only go to 2013. This is the winter of 2012, 2013. And I was looking up the latest possible data, which is still being assembled in a website called Be Informed. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, right there, Be Informed, which anyone can look at, and it's kind of sad, I think, but devastating for the people in Mississippi. The beekeepers have lost more than 60% of their colonies that year, and the other averages range from 15 to 40%. 15% being the acceptable range. This is very serious. For one thing, people, this is their business, their livelihood. They've put a lot into the investment, and what's going to happen to those beekeepers. To try to sum this up, we think that the U.S. beekeepers may have lost up to about 80% of their hives since 2000. And I don't have to be a business owner to know that that is not sustainable. Well, I'm so glad you asked, because we're going to get right into that. Now, one of the problems we think is pesticides. And there was a study that showed that about 66 different pesticides could be found in the brood comb of honeybees. Since about 1992, the use of neonicotinoids, which are systemic pesticides, has greatly increased. I'm going to be talking about imidacloprid, but there are some other very commonly used ones, and Jody could tell us about all of these in much more detail than I might be able to do. But they impact the central nervous system of insects. They also impact their reproductive biology and their behavior. And so there are many problems to do with the pesticides. But there are some other factors, too, as to why the honeybees are being lost. Many of them lead a stressful lifestyle if they are nomadic. That is, they're migrating on a truck, mind you, to one crop and then another. In Maine, we've had about 75,000 honeybee colonies arrive in Maine, especially for the low bush or wild blueberry crop, in just the past few years. Each year this happens. That's a lot of bees. And they're coming from as far away as California. And then they rotate around to other crops in the east, and they go south. And okay, but that's a monoculture diet that they're expected to have. And the truth of it is, honeybees don't like wild blueberry. They will go to practically any other plant at the edge of the field rather than go to the crop and do their job. So this is a big problem for the blueberry growers. You might say, well, then why do they not bring them? But they don't want to risk, remember, wild blueberry is one of those crops that must have a bee. They don't want to risk not having a crop. So they put the bees on the fields and hope for good weather. So this phenomenon of the loss of the honeybee colonies over winter has a name. It started to be called the colony collapse disorder, or CCD, and it's still called that, and it's still a problem. But it seems as though there are other factors involved also, and that it's a multiple, there are many reasons for this phenomenon. And some of the others are mites, fungal diseases, other diseases, not just fungi, and additional stressors. Now here's the real question, and I know some of you can't read this from in the back, but this says native bees impacted too, and that should have question mark, because we don't really know. This shows one of the worst of the pests that come into the honeybee hive. There are others too, but this is the Varroa mite, which is native to Asia. And you can see it here. It looks like a little dot, and it's sucking the blood of this bee. It can greatly debilitate the hive when there are many of these mites inside the colony. Now, I like to offer a balanced approach to the pesticide issue because I remember working in a local greenhouse nursery, and it was my job to go get my pesticide applicator's license and apply the Temic to the greenhouse plants. Temic is an organic phosphate. It has now been withdrawn from the market. It is banned. That's how bad it is. So I remember how bad the organophosphates were, and I also have personal experience with how cavalier an applicator can be when you're handling something all day. You sort of forget to, oh yeah, you wash your hands before lunch, you're wearing your gloves, you're wearing your suit, all that stuff, but it's very easy to develop a little bit of a, shall we say, a lack of sensitivity to just how serious that chemical is. That's easy. It happened to me, and I'm cautious. So, the neonicotinoids came along in about 1996 or so, and these presented an attractive alternative because they didn't seem to be as harmful as the organophosphates. They didn't obviously kill birds or mammals. They didn't obviously hurt people. Yes, they killed insects, and that was good. Now, their use has been increasing steadily, and alarmingly, if I may dare use that word. And they're used especially on cotton, on vegetables and fruits, such as soy and corn. They're systemic, meaning that they're throughout all parts of the plant. They're in its sap, they're in its tissues, they're in all of its cells. They're in its nectar and pollen. Remember the slide about nectar and pollen? Oh, that's the food for the bees. And they remain in the plant long after the treatment. So, if you go out and treat your lawn with, I'm not going to use any product name, but something to do with trying to get the grubs out of the lawn, right? And you put the chemical in the lawn, and you think you've solved that problem of the grubs. But the rose fine roots take up the chemical. It's a systemic pesticide, remember. Goes up into the rose plant, and now it's in the flowers, in the nectar and pollen. This is where it's relevant to bees. And it's there, we think, for as long as 5 years or maybe more. There's a big question mark about that. Now, I try to keep up with the literature, and there's a lot about this because the Europeans are very unhappy with some of the effects of the neonicotinoids. And you will find different reports, some that seem to show no serious effects, but others that show, yes, at field realistic dosages, there is injury to honeybees and bumblebees. And then body size of the smaller bees might mean that less chemical would affect them than is needed to affect a bumblebee or a honeybee. So the smaller bees maybe are even more impacted. Now this is a really interesting web page. I'm sure Jody knows all about this. But if you go to the USGS and just type in National Water Quality, you're there. And you can see a long list of chemicals that get into the water supply or that are being monitored as potential for that. And so here we're looking at imidacloprid. This is one of the neonicotinoids very commonly used on crops. And you can see that in the year 2000, all the white is estimated to have almost no imidacloprid in the water. But the orange is estimated to have it. And you can see that in 2004 there's more, a lot more. And then in 2009 still more, 2011 yes, and 2014. Maine has it less in 2014. I know you can't see this, I'll just tell you. 2014 less than in 2004. So maybe there's been a reduction. At least this is estimated. But it's in the potato growing area, and there are also mixed vegetables in the southern coastal area. Anybody have a question about this so far? I'll just keep going. All right, so pesticides. That's one kind of pesticide, but there are an awful lot of them, and it's not hard to find them in the greenhouse and nursery trade. So we think that the beneficial insects are being hit with a double whammy when herbicides and fungicides are also used in combination with the pesticides. There's something about those chemicals that tends to increase the virility of the chemical in the pesticide. Now I have a question for the marketplace. Can the end user adjust to having imperfect plants? I don't know. It's going to be a stretch for us in the U.S. We're used to really high quality, perfect stuff. But we need to look at that question, don't you think so? And here's the good news. Customer pressure and supply chain pressure is making a difference. I went into a large chain, I'll not name the name, and I was surprised that the pesticide section had mostly empty shelves. And instead there was a little sign that said, go to your cooperative extension and ask your question about identifying your pest, and then they'll help you figure out what to do. I thought, oh my goodness, this is revolutionary. So I think that when there are other large chain stores that have started to mark the plants that have been treated with systemic pesticides so that you can know when you're going to purchase a plant whether or not you're buying something that has the pesticide in it. This is all good because frankly I don't think we're going to get all the way we need to go with garlic and soapy water. Much as I like that alternative. In my garden that might be what I need, but on the kind of scale we're talking about, I don't think that's going to do it.
Can we trust that people know, that a supermarket chain knows where whether, like, are they testing the water that farmers are using to produce the produce?
I think I know what you're asking, and I'll go back to this for just a second. No. But we can go to our suppliers and say, could you please carry plant material that hasn't been treated with any systemic pesticides? That's really important to me. And if Jody goes, and Jeannie goes, and Alex goes, if we all go and ask that question of our favorite supplier, and I'm going to encourage you to consider asking local suppliers, because we like to try to have local businesses, ask them to please either mark or bring along the organic or pesticide-free products, then I think we will have success with that after a while. So I think it's up to us to be part of this and not just assume it's going to happen without us. Now here's something that I'm not sure you've followed yet. But ticks, were they bad at your house this year? Oh, I had so many. I could step off the front step into the driveway and back onto the front step and I'd have a tick on me. I don't know where they came from. It is. And so people are looking for something they can do to control the ticks in their yard. And a very innovative solution was suggested, and now people can make this at home out of, toilet paper rolls and put a little bit of permethrin on a bit of cotton in the toilet paper roll and set it out in a mouse runway. The mice take the cotton that's been treated and the permethrin doesn't hurt the mouse. or the vole, or whichever rodent it might be. But now it's going to take it and put it in its nest, and so any ticks that are preying on the mouse and its young will die. Okay, next season, mouse abandons that nest. I don't know why they do that. It needs a new nest. And the bumblebee queen comes along looking for her best nest spot for the season, and oftentimes she is attracted to a rodent nest, an abandoned rodent nest. We think she might smell the urine. And she'll go in there and make that her nest. Now, if it's got this cotton with the treated chemical, the pesticide in there, this is not good for the bee because permethrin is highly toxic to bees. I feel like Don Quixote tilting at a windmill on this because I know people are very worried about the ticks, and they should be, but this is serious. If a lot of people do the tick tube thing, and you can buy them commercially or make your own, I don't see how that's going to benefit the bees. So I'm kind of worried about this one.
It seems like that would affect, it seems like other insects, etc. I'm surprised it doesn't affect mice because it seems really strong.
Yes, that's a very good point. I had read that permethrin is harmful to pet cats if it's wet. So I wear, if I'm doing work out in a field, I will wear gaiters that I've treated with permethrin, but I take them off before I come home, and I definitely don't let them near my cats. And if they're wet, that's when they're harmful to the pets. So are there other animals that they might be harmful to? I can't answer that question. I'm not a veterinarian. But yes, a good one to pay attention to and try to figure out the answer to that. Now, a friend of mine, and it's Lois Stack, said, it seems unfair to invite the bees in and then have all this poison in their environment. So in our yards, where we do have some control of what's going on, we might choose to have no pesticides. And I don't know if you can meet all your goals and do that, but probably I'm talking to the converted right here. Okay, so what we come down to, and why we got money for this grant, was this question. If the managed honeybees aren't sustainable, if we can't bring them in and count on them to do the work of pollinating lowbush blueberry, then who's going to do the work? Can the native bees do it? This is a beautiful bee, isn't it? So here we are in blueberry season. This is probably low, 75 million. In 2011, the crop was 83 million pounds. Maine, and we also have the Maritime Provinces and British Columbia producing wild blueberries, not high bush. But the price is down. It's way down. A grower told me just the other day it's 18 cents, which is terrible. It's a devastation. I don't know what's going to happen with all the blueberry fields in the barrens up in Columbia Falls. Some people have been up there and seen that. It's amazing. There are like 5,000 acres of opening in blueberries. It's a huge investment. Will that grow up to forest? That wasn't the question when we were getting our grant. Mind you, this was 2011, 2012. So we got the grant. And our purpose was to try to figure out how to assure that the native bees are taken care of in the lowbush blueberry ecosystem, which is a boom bust for insects that visit flowers. Because as you probably know, when it's the crop year, there are billions of flowers, more than bees can get to. And when it's the prune year, and this is every other year, there are no flowers in the field. None. So how do little bees keep having they have to feed their young, every single year. And so we were trying to figure out how you could have gardens near the blueberry fields that would be effective, that the bees would visit the plants that you put out there, and there are many implications for other kinds of farms and gardens as well, not just blueberry. And we got a grant from the USDA for $3.4 million. Didn't all come to me. And it went for 5 years. It just finished last year. I'm still writing the papers up. Universities in Maine, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, and Kentucky. And we were looking at the native bees that pollinate these crops, the wild blueberry, cranberry, apple, and squash. And there are many different aspects to this. I'm not going to get into this, but there were a lot of measurements of pesticides in the insects and the pests and diseases that affect them. And this is pollinator habitat enhancement effectiveness, which is government speak for a program through the NRCS, that's the Natural Resources Conservation Service, part of the USDA. And so we're able to, I hope, refine the pollinator habitat enhancement recommendations that farmers will see and that home gardeners can benefit from. Now, one of the things that is part of this is there are plant lists available. And you can find them online and you can find them in books. They're very helpful. And they seem to tell you what you could plant that will take care of the bees. But very few of the plants in the list have actually been tested in the field with people watching, doing timed observations to see if any bees come. And maybe the plant got in the list because somebody in California saw a bee on purple coneflower. But does that translate to Maine? Now, we do have new evidence by Eric Venturini, who now works for the Xerces Society through the NRCS, and Frank Drummond, who's my boss, that pollinator plantings can make quite a difference in bee abundance, but also in the pollination services. So these plantings that people might want to put out actually can make a big difference. And so we started up the bee module experiment. Now we call it that because we're able to sort of plug in a plant and then take it back out again for another year. We can put it back in if we want to, but this is a common garden study, meaning that the same treatments are tried in multiple places at the same time so that you can get away from the idea of a site effect. And I think I've said all that already. The idea is that if the honeybees become too expensive, and they already are really expensive, then these native wild bees could do the work of pollinating the blueberry crop. Now, just a few things before I get into the methods. We had about 90 plant species that we tried over 4 field seasons. That's a lot of plants. And the plants didn't behave themselves. So we had to go in there and deadhead and cut them back and plant them again. It was kind of challenging, I have to say. These were the farms. These 2 farms are owned by the University of Maine. One is Blueberry Hill Farm in Jonesboro, where you can go and take a look at various experiments that they have going there. And Rogers Farm in Stillwater up by Old Town, and that also has a wonderful demonstration. The bee module has been dismantled in both of these, so you couldn't see that, but there's much else that you could take a look at. And then there were also 2 privately owned blueberry farms in Blue Hill, and that was where the study took place, those 4 farms. Now we divided the bees that we were seeing. We weren't capturing them, so we had to figure out how to teach our students who were doing a lot of the field work, and I was, how to recognize the bees and put them into groups so that it could be repeatable. In science, if it isn't unbiased and repeatable, you're just another science writer. Oh, nothing against science writers, but that's the idea. So honeybees were a species that we used, but this group of bumblebees was a lot of different species that were just thrown into a kind of a category, bumblebees. But there was one bumblebee we thought we could recognize every time we saw it, the tricolored or orange-banded bumblebee that I've already talked about. We thought we could recognize that, so we did have a second species. So now we've got 2 species and a group. We had another group called the sweat bees. These are the small dark or metallic green bees. And then we had the other bee category. Now this might seem as if it's unimportant. It's just miscellaneous, but some very important bees were in that group. So I try to remind myself, other bees doesn't mean just nothing. This is Andrena. You remember Andrena is the minor bee that has nomada going into her nest and laying its egg on her loaf and so forth. And she's on willow. So this just gives you an idea of some of the things that we were looking at. We wanted early flowering and mid flowering and late, annual, perennial, and woody. We tried native plants and some that are introduced in our area. So this says willow and this says oregano. We tried some nest habitat. I'm not going to talk about that tonight. And then we also had, and I'm not going to talk about this either, but we tested some wild type plants versus their fancy cultivars to see if the bees had a distinct preference. And this isn't to scale. There was actually a 1 meter wide pathway between each of these little 1 meter squared blocks of plants. But you can see that they could be arranged variously, and this enabled us to get between them so that we could do the observations. We had to try to observe so that we weren't casting a shadow on the flowers. Always had to have the sun coming down, and then we're looking at the bee, because we think the bees are oriented by the sun. Now, we did these 1 minute observations, and for a given farm and a given day, there were 3, which you might think, 3 minutes? How could that be anything that you would find important? And that's per kind of flower, so per plant species. Well, after 14,000 of these, start to get some patterns. And so we're pretty sure that because of the size of the data set, we can say something about this. We found almost 18,000 bees in 4 years. It's like, wow, build it and they will come. Now, here's what we found, though. And this is biology, so no one's going to be surprised. But the bees did their own thing. And for any of our bee taxa, honeybee, bumblebees, tricolored bumblebees, sweat bees, and other bees, they each did their own thing. They all had their own preferences, and no two were alike. And the bumblebees and the tricolored bumblebees increased over time. We can't say that they were increasing because of our planting and the food that we were offering. Maybe, but they were increasing. We're quite sure about that. We've been able to show it. But they differed from each other in which plants they liked. Year and site were mostly not significant. And the top plants differed by bee taxa, and I'll show you a few of those aspects. Now here you're looking at some pie charts, and I know you can't read this, but this is Blueberry Hill Farm in Jonesboro. This is one of the Blue Hill farms. This is another of the Blue Hill farms, and this is the Stillwater farm, which isn't a blueberry farm, but all 3 of the others are. The yellow is honeybees. The black is the bumblebees. The orange, I hope you can distinguish that, is the tricolored bumblebee. And the green is the sweat bees. Red is the other bees. You see any of those pie charts that looks identical to any other? Isn't that something? They were all different. These are the years 2012, 13, 14, and 15. So I look at that and I think, pardon me?
Sorry, were any of the farms managed organically?
Yes. Yes. 1 was and 2 were low input, the blueberry farms. And the farm at Stillwater, I don't know if they're certified organic, but they're low input. Okay, so, okay, you might go, okay, well, what does that mean? And believe me, if you can figure it out, I want to hear it. But I think what it means is that the sites are different from one year to another, and each site differs from any other, and the years tend to have some variation, but the bees are just, and these are all, for a given year, they're all on the same plants, because we had the same plants in each of the gardens each year. I thought you'd like that. Now meadowsweet. Now we've got a different way of looking at the bee groups, black and white. So honeybee is white, and you can see just a little bit of it here, 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 here. Black is the bumblebees. The orange-banded is gray. The sweat bees have the vertical stripes, and the other bees have the horizontal stripes. And you're looking at July, August, and September for 2012, then for 2013, 2014, and 2015. So I look at this and I go, they did something different each year and each month, and no two are alike. And it's completely baffling. This is a very common plant which we have. You're going to pass it on your way out to your car, meadowsweet. You might know this. It's in the rose family, and it's a native plant that is very common. It's sometimes a bane to hay farmers because it might get in the field, and if you don't mow often enough, it will turn into a woody shrub mess. Okay, here's white wood aster, another native plant. And we have the same groups, honeybee white, bumblebees are black, gray is the orange banded, that's the tricolored. The sweat bees have the vertical stripes, and the other bees have horizontal. And we're now looking at August, September, October for 2012. August, September, October for 2013, August, September, 2014, and 2015. Once again, it's just all over the place. So, you see my dilemma. Now, top bee plants, and this is from 84 plant subjects. Some of the plants failed, or we had to lump all the willows. There were like 11 species. We had to lump them all, that kind of thing. So that's why fewer plant subjects. And now we're looking at their rank. Top plant, and second most, and the third most, fourth, and fifth. For the honeybees, the bumblebees, the tricolored or orange-banded, sweat bees, and other bees is the last column. And I know people in the back can't read this, but what you're looking at is a different top plant for each bee taxa. And I'll tell you what they are. Summer sweet, a single marigold, not double, didn't like those. Yellow sweet clover, Iceland poppy, meadow pastels, and willows for the other bees. And it goes on from there. So, okay, no two species of plants show up twice in this table.
You ready to give up yet?
I have one more. Yes?
I don't mean this, I mean study.
Oh, well, I have to write the papers and
You must be confused as hell by now.
well, I have found things to say about this. It's actually pretty wonderful in a way. Because what we're looking at is bees that are used to a climate where they can't have a narrow niche. They have to be widely ranging to find their food. And while they're foraging on one kind of plant, they're also keeping their eye on this one's about to come out. And so I think that's the key, is that these are wide niche animals that aren't, at least at the scale of the data that we were collecting, they are not specifying and being very particular to any one species. Now, how this affects you, however, is some of these you may want to try at home. There were six plants that we put in the gardens for more than 3 years, and most of these were in the gardens for 4 years. So we have more that we can say about these plants than about ones that we just grew for 1 year or 2. And now we're looking at the ranks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And the honeybees, bumblebees, tricolored, sweat bees, other bees, and this is all bees, all together. And now we can see that butterfly milkweed was a biggie with the honeybees, but also with the tricolored bumblebees. Meadow sweet, very big with the sweat bees and the other bees. Summer sweet, this is Clethra alnifolia, wonderful plant, native farther south in Maine in swamps, but it'll grow pretty much everywhere. So worth a try in your garden if you like a shrub that flowers late in the summer. So not to make this into more than it needs to be, but you get the idea that it's kind of all over the place again, and I'm happy to share this list with you if you want to see it in more detail. Now, in your garden, here's what I think you could do. Not tonight, but tomorrow. You could go and take a look at which plants are the bees visiting in your garden. Maybe you do this already. And make a note of those. And perhaps give those more room in your garden than the ones that aren't visited much. I'll give you an example of one that I never see bees on, and maybe it's just me. I'm willing to believe that other people see bees on it, but that's daylilies. I like them. They have beautiful colors. I have quite a number of them, but I don't give them more room. I just sort of let them be in their little corner, semi-shade, and I try to give much more room to butterfly milkweed and purple coneflower and oregano, some easy to grow perennials. So, but you could do that if you wish. Mind you, people have many reasons for having gardens. It doesn't have to be all about bees. Maybe you're planting for the hummingbirds, or just for color or for cuts. Whatever you want to do is fine. But this is just how you could emphasize bees if you choose to do that in your garden. So, more room for the ones that the bees are visiting. You could try using native species, but one of our papers is going to show that the introduced plants, not invasive, but introduced plants actually have an important role for filling some gaps when the native plants might not be in flower. So we don't want to assume that just because it's not native, you can't use it. No, there really aren't the hard and fast rules, at least with bees. This isn't the same talk that you heard at Emlyn Hall, wonderful talk about planting for birds. Those really do need the native trees, the native shrubs, the native plants. But for bees, they're not so fussy apparently. But here's a good one. Try for early, mid, and late. Or early, mid, late. You know, have like 9 different sections of the growing season and try to make sure something's out there for the bees every time. Even 3 plants, different species, in flower at a given time in the season. If you can manage it, it's a little bit of a juggling act. And certainly, if you can, avoid chemical pest control. Now here's some examples of early blooming. I've already mentioned willow. That's a big one, especially with andrena and some bumblebees. Here's a native plant that you might like, the northern fly honeysuckle. There are many others native, and you'll just start noticing these. This is one you can plant that comes back every year. Doesn't really take over. Bumblebees like it. And these are queens when the early spring plants are flowering. Mid-season, thyme. And you can mow over it, set the mower high and have it in the lawn. Oregano. What a terrific bee plant that is. And you can eat it. And it flowers for a long time, spreads, but not so badly that you would be sorry you planted it. Yes?
Your other list said Greek oregano. Does it actually matter what type of?
We found in our data that the red oregano, sometimes called zorba, or maybe there are a bunch of red ones, but we called it red oregano. That one also attracts bees at a very high rate and has a long flowering season. So both Greek and the reddish are good. Does that answer the question? Purple coneflower.
Types other than those 2. I don't know what the choices are, but I was just wondering if it was important to choose the right oregano.
I don't think you can go wrong with oregano based on what I've seen. And if you want some that I know works, ask me, Jody. I'm going to give you some.
I actually have one that works, but I don't know if it's Greek or not.
It probably is if it has the white flowers.
No, it has purple flowers.
Oh, well then that could be the zorba, which sounds Greek, but it has red. Okay, so late. Now this is the challenging one, is late. And certainly the silver rod that's very common here, and the golden rods, not all golden rods are equal. But if you have golden rods, you have a good start. The Canada goldenrod tends to not have very many insect visitors, I've noticed. Here's summer sweet, which is going to come into flower in about 2 weeks at my house. And that is a really nice plant. So if you're going to write everything down, don't forget to write down Clethra ulnifolia, summer sweet. And then we didn't test this one, but I see this a lot in my own garden, and it goes until hard frost, and the bumblebee goes right inside that tube-like flower. It's quite amazing. And there are many kinds, too, that you can find. Now, you might already have some good habitat. You don't have to do a thing. You don't have to plant anything. Maybe just mow less. Cut it back less. Or maybe you need to cut it back more so it doesn't get shaded out. Could be a little bit of a balancing act. I leave that up to you. Here's a native sweat bee in a late goldenrod just before the frost. Now, sometimes you see recommendations to have a bee pasture, and if you have a tractor and you like to have big things happening on your property, okay, go for it. But you'd want to know that site preparation is going to be really important if you're going to make the wildflower mix do anything. How do I know this? Experience. I managed to put a wildflower planting on what I think must have been a barn site. And I put it on a landfill with another grant, and it turned out that witchgrass was in there. And I have seen some pretty big weeds. So I'm going to suggest that site preparation is something you really want to take a look at and not just put the seeds out and think things are going to be great. One way that you could consider preparing the site is to shallow till repeatedly. And then you could sow a cover crop and then go and till again and then put your seed mix in, or even do that for several years. Sometimes people are finding that if they put plastic down, but in our climate it may not get hot enough to really kill the weeds underneath, so I'm not going to tell you that that's the best way. And you'd want to know this, that plantings for bees and other pollinators may have to be replanted after a relatively short time, considering the amount of money and time and effort you went into putting it. They don't have eternal life. They have a lifespan. But it's a good way to support your honeybees with buckwheat and some others. So there are many really good crops that you can put out there and be glad that you did it. Now let's talk just briefly about nests. It could be that you have some bees that are nesting in the ground, mining bees and so forth, and you may find them next spring. Some of them come out in the later part of the summer. I have some on my land that come out in September. It's always a thrill because I'm there with the camera trying to, and I do get some good pictures. So it's not only in the spring, but that's when you tend to see them more often. And there are stem nesting bees that really like to nest in, shall we say, injured stems of elderberry, staghorn sumac, blackberry, raspberry. And you might find some metallic green sweat bees are going to come.
Can you deliberately injure the...
Yes, I give you permission, Jody. Go for it. Now, this is in Jonesboro. And Frank Drummond put a berm of soil, and then the farm crew said, oh, that's where we're supposed to dump the stuff that we moved from over here. So they started using it as the dump. Mind you, just vegetation, not trash. And we wanted to find bee nests in there, but that didn't happen. So you would want to be prepared. There's not a guarantee that just because you put nest habitat out, you're going to get bees. But you'd want to know that people are doing this everywhere, trying to have bee hotels, and it's really fun. You might have a good time working on this. Sometimes, unless they get changed and cleaned, they might be a buildup of some pests that eat the bees or disease. So read up on this if you're interested in going this route. But you can try nest blocks. You can try bundles of hollow stems or bamboo sections. Here's a native natural bee habitat for nests. These are the galleries of boring beetles in spruce. You might have that and might not have thought of that as bee habitat. Now, here's something I've never seen. I wish I could. the leafcutter bee carrying a piece of leaf. And what it's going to do is it will cut the leaf into a little round section, and then that will be the place that it uses to close the door on where it put the loaf and the egg. Or it might line the chamber with the leaf. I just thought that was a wonderful picture, and I stole it from the internet. But if you see rounded holes in your garden plants, in the leaves, you could think, leaf cutter. Maybe. Why not? Now we're almost done for tonight, but I wanted to remind the people who have honeybees that their bees like to have a drink. And so you might have a shallow receptacle. It doesn't have to be fancy, but float a piece of wood on it so they have a landing platform. Maybe you knew that already. Isn't that a great picture? That's by Dwayne of Dewey's Bees. Now, where are you going to go with this information that you got this evening? Some of it you already knew, but I bet I might have covered something you hadn't realized. Our papers are going to come out. They're going to be technical, but we expect to have some fact sheets that will encapsulate the information, make it readily digestible for the home gardener. And I think we're all paying for the rusty patch bumblebee to be recovered. That's what the language is in the Federal Endangered Species Act. And so I suggest we could be watching for how this is going to go. It's going to be habitat that will protect other species besides the rusty patch. And I think they're going to have trouble finding the rusty patch, but they're already considering moving the rusty patch here, there, trying to recover it in good, suitable habitat. So it's going to be very interesting, and you might wish to read up on that. And then I'm going to encourage you to make your own observations, because the scientists aren't the only ones who know about this kind of thing, and your observations are unique to your yard and your garden, your farm. So I suggest that you're the best one to assess the habitat in your yard. And if you're minimizing pesticides and you're sharing what you've been learning with others, that would be important. Many people are getting interested in protecting pollinator corridors, which might not be that important here so far from a city, but realistically, we've got a lot of habitat between here and Blue Hill that is closed canopy forest, and that's a low quality habitat for most bees. They really need the sun, they need those early successional plants. So maybe a corridor in Brooksville isn't such a far-fetched idea. And then if you can support local growers, that's better for everybody. Now there are many things that you can find that you can send away for or download. And you may not be aware that there's a Maine Bumblebee Atlas that's a citizen science opportunity. And I think they're in year 3 of a 5-year horizon. So if that seems like something you'd want to get involved with, you can contact them. This says mainebumblebeeatlas.umf.maine.edu. Portland has a pollinator partnership. You might want to read up about that. The Xerxes Society for Conservation of Invertebrates is highly recommended, and you might enjoy that. And this bumblebee poster is available for, I think, a nominal fee. Notice, however, that the artist left half the legs off, which I find frustrating. Could have just put a little leg, right? Like just a part of a leg, and I don't know. They didn't ask me to do it, so they get what they get. Okay. So this is to summarize. We're at the end, folks. Work with what you have. That's a starting place anyway. In your yard, notice which plants the bees are visiting. Increase the area that you're allotting to the bee plants. Use native species if you can. At least avoid invasive plants. One that the bees visit, but I wouldn't have it near my property, is autumn olive. If you have any of that, please get rid of it. Okay, try for early, mid, and late blooming plants, multiples of those at any one time, and be aware of nest habitat such as bare patches in the lawn. And then, let's not forget, avoid pesticides. The bees are going to thank you for that. Now, the funding for this study came from the USDA, from the University of Maine, New England horticulturists. I have co-investigators involved. It wasn't just me doing all this. Frank Drummond and Lois Bergstack. Thank you to both of them. And then we had more than 16 University of Maine students who did a lot of the data collection, and they were just wonderful.
You have to split the $3 million with them?
They didn't get as much money as they might have earned. I mean, they got their paycheck, but they worked hard. And it was hot sometimes. So I want to invite any questions, or if people would like to have a discussion about any aspect of this. Yes?
What about bee pheromones? You didn't mention anything about it.
Bee pheromones?
Yeah, they go, they smell, they have pheromones.
Yes,
They're
we
on bee highways, they're pretty part of those, right?
We didn't measure that, but one of the grad students who worked in this project looked at chemicals in nectar, and that was very interesting. She was able to...
I've heard pesticides interrupt pheromones, you know, interrupt it.
Yes.
Because that one bee can go out and find food and then come back to the hive and go, hey man, I found them. They do a little wobble dance and go,
Yes.
this is how you get there.
Yes.
I don't understand that. I mean, I don't think anybody does.
Well, there's a scientist named Tom Seeley who's done some really important work on that, and he's been able to show that if there are multiple scouts who've come back and have their report, it's the one with the most enthusiasm that gets everybody to say, all right, we'll go see what you want to show us. So it's the enthusiasm level that Tom found.
How do they show that?
Well, it waggles the most and like goes in circles and does its little, you know, it's like,
Human screaming. You know, doesn't, I mean, the pesticide thing is a pretty big deal, you know, Roundup, and that's bad stuff. It interrupts the pheromone. The pheromone thing is really weird. I've studied it quite a lot. And the pesticides stopped it. The bees said, whoop, no, I don't like that. So did you study that at all?
no, I'm not actually a pesticide person. But the people in our group, or I should say on our team, who did that have some incredible information that is all going to come out in the next year or two. And minute amounts of pesticide were found in some pretty unlikely, relatively unexposed bees. So,
Roundup and they grow up, I guess.
yeah.
Well, as an herbicide, Roundup destroys habitat.
Yes, oh, it certainly does. That's a good point. I forgot to mention this. I've talked about these papers or a fact sheet. If anyone's interested, please put your name and an email, and it might be a year before you hear from me, but I will be glad to keep that and send you what we have as a PDF file that would be an attachment on an email. So if that interests you, be sure and put your name. Yes.
Hi, I have a question about, so I have a kind of large lawn and I want to mow it at least, you know, all of it once a year just to keep trees from growing. And would you say, like, what would be the best time? It's really, really early spring or in terms of the bees and, or after, when would I kind of stop? Is it just when all the flowers die from the frost, so late fall, if I were just to mow once?
Can I ask a couple more questions? Is your lawn large enough that you see bobolink? Birds that migrate from Uruguay?
But I'm just been there a year, I guess. I haven't noticed them. That's, well, it's maybe not that big of a field area.
Okay.
Because you're saying if they're in.
Yes, they would want to have you mow after their chicks are flown. And that might be mid-August, even into September. They have a lot of trouble because they're in hay fields, and those get mowed in late June for the first hay cutting, so it's terrible for the bobolinks. Another consideration, do you have milkweed?
I think there is some, but not a lot.
Okay. Milkweed, some people consider it a terrible weedy pest, but it's a native plant, and it's really important to monarch butterflies, and bees love it. So if you want to encourage your milkweed, why not let it all go to seed and have it mowed at the very end of October, before the snow comes. So when you go home tomorrow, Do it tomorrow. Don't have to go out with a flashlight tonight. But why not take a look at where the milkweed is and consider kind of nurturing that so it'll spread if that's acceptable with your other goals. Yeah. Jeannie?
I'm wondering if the research that your research results that looked kind of haphazard and all over the place in terms of the bees choosing all different things,
Yeah.
if that helps the theory around the stresses of a monoculture diet for honeybees.
Oh, yes. I think that's a really good point. I think you're onto something. That the fact that the bees are choosing so many different plants indicates that the monoculture is just a really stressful part of their...
Right, the bee was saying year after year, I'm going to go back to this specific plant, but they are choosing to diversify their food source.
Yes. That's a good point. I'm going to make a note of that. I'm going to put that in my paper and I'll give you a thank you at the end. Make sure I get your last name spelled correctly.
It sounds like, it seems like more research, good data is needed in that area.
Yes, that's right. Well, we were talking earlier about how bees may select some plants based, this is honeybees and bumblebees, may select some plants based on some chemicals in the nectar that can help them to self-medicate. And you can look this up in Google and just see that it's in the very early stages of research, and it's not my field, so I can't tell you very much about it, but it's just fascinating to think that the animals would know where to go to get what they need to solve some kind of deficit in their diet. Anything else? You've been a wonderful audience. How about this? Jody, you're the last one.
Oh, I have more than one question. Mississippi had such a drastic decline. Did you look at the commercial agricultural crops that could have been linked to that happening in that state?
I wouldn't dare just wave my arms about that, but I think they've got cotton down there. I know they've been tearing up the hardwood forest and planting crops, row crops in the forest land, what was the forest land. So I think there's a lot of disruption, but I don't actually know what the story is there. I think it is a story, and I just pulled it off that website, so you might poke around in, what is it? Be improved? Be informed and see if you can figure out, because there are comments down lower in these reports, and it's really just brand new data that they're just putting in, so you may not get the satisfaction that you want, but if you follow that website you might eventually uncover what that situation is. It just sounds terrible for the people who are in the business.
You, I'm sure, have been following the research on neonics.
Yes,
And
been trying to read up on that.
I mean, I'm not systematic about it, but from what I can see over the last few years, the evidence has become more and more conclusive. I mean,
Yes.
it's the smoking gun, truly. And as you probably know, the Maine Pesticide Control Board has a list of approved pesticides, insecticides to use for brown-tail moth, just to give one example, and 4 of them, 4 out of 7
Are
are
neonic?
neonics. I mean, they're not admitting that it's a problem, and they're trying to blame mites, Varroa mites, and I have seen studies arguing that the stress of pesticide exposure sets these up for mite infestation.
That could be. The mites also weaken the bees, and the diseases get transmitted in association with the mites. So it's a big, complicated story, and beekeepers would definitely want to be reading about this and be familiar with some of the hazards. And there are some things that you can do, more than we can get into right now, but I think that there are directions that you can go, and I really want to hear from you if you've solved this problem. Well, you've been just wonderful. Warren is standing there like, come on, Alison, it's time. And I just want to thank you all so much.